Okay, good morning, everyone. All right, how about yesterday? All right. Awesome day, I've got to say. Hopefully you enjoyed it and got as much out of it as I did yesterday. A phenomenal day from beginning to end, from our kind of plenary speakers to the panelists to the questions posed by everybody, but particularly the midshipmen and cadets in the audience. Really enjoyed it. And under normal circumstances, I would say, yeah, tough act to follow today. But if you take a look at the program, you take a look at the lineup today, in so many ways, the schedule for the remainder of the day is kind of where the rubber meets the road, as they say. It's the application of many of the concepts that were taught. So the plan is to do a bit of a deep dive into the service perspectives, U.S. service perspectives, and then also the perspectives of our closest allies in the application of character development and assessment across the span of today. So we are really looking forward to that. Today is a great way to follow up a successful day yesterday. And on that point, yesterday doesn't happen, today doesn't happen without a really heavy lift on the part of a really talented team. And there's a few people, though, on this team, the Stockdale Center team, that I'd like to point out in particular. It was a little over a year ago that Dr. Ed Barrett, of course, who most of you know, our Director of Research at the Stockdale Center, and Professor David Luban, our Distinguished Chair of Ethics, came and had a sit down with me about the plan for the coming year's topic. And every year, we're never disappointed by the topics selected because they cast the net far and wide as to what are the most pressing concerns, pressing challenges regarding military ethics. And from year to year, whether it's AI, cyber, threats to liberal order, democracy, just war tradition, whatever it happens to be, it always just seems to be kind of the hit for the year. But I have to admit, when they put on the table character development assessment, my suspicion was that this would have a special resonance, especially at a service academy. And sure enough, as we kind of trotted this out and asked for some inputs as to how to frame and shape this thing from the superintendent and the commandant who you met yesterday and others, it became really clear that not only was this a point of fascination for most, but this was a particular point of emphasis at this moment in time, not at service academies, not in the military per se, but in the nation. In fact, you could say internationally. The idea, the notion of developing character, deliberately developing character, and then devising means to assess character is kind of just what the doctor ordered on the global stage, we might say. So it's been a fascinating run. I've had the privilege over the span of this past year to sit in with our resident research fellows and Dr. Barrett and Professor Luban and the rest, and have learned something every single week. But I'll have to say as well, as far as their efforts, none of this would happen either if it weren't for a lot of logistics and administrative heavy lifting. So Ms. Karen Ornberg, who's standing in the back, many of you have communicated with extensively throughout the past year, our Director of Events, truly gets everybody into this location. There's a lot of moving parts, clearly. So between Karen and Ed, it kind of takes some really talented Air Force professionals, both retired Air Force, to pull off a great conference at Navy. Go Air Force, she's back there. She paid me to say that. No, she didn't. But it takes two really talented Air Force folks to pull off this conference, and they do a phenomenal job. And of course, Karen is assisted by Miss Sarah White, I think she's back there somewhere, who's our financial management analyst, who gets all the budgets and so on together and the lifting on that side of things. So again, a great team effort, but I want to particularly focus on them to pull this whole thing out. So well done. And then my final point is this. This is a great teaming process as well with the Naval Institute. Vice Admiral Pete Daly, who was here yesterday, I'm not sure if he's here today. His folks from the Naval Institute enable us to use this facility. It's a phenomenal facility. For those of you that have come to McCain conferences for many years, you might remember we started in Luce Hall in the Bow Club over there, and then moved to Alumni Hall, the Bow Coppage Room in Alumni Hall. Good venues, for sure, but this is world class. I'm really, really happy with this partnering here with the Naval Institute these past couple of years, and it seems like a match that'll go forward. And of course, the philanthropic support of Mayor Michael Bloomberg actually gives us the resources to do this. The Stockdale Center is comprised, at least its budget, is comprised of about 97% philanthropic support. So almost all of the resources, the money that enables all that the Stockdale Center does is raised philanthropically. And this specific conference is put on due to the generosity of Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And I had an opportunity to have dinner with him a few years ago to thank him for this support. And like David Brooks talked about yesterday, he shared 100 anecdotes about Senator McCain and how his character kind of stood above so many others on Capitol Hill for many, many years. And for that reason and others, he's so happy to support us getting together like this on an annual basis, kind of in his name, and in this case, in his memory. So thanks to all those who support as well. So great day lined up. We've got Ed and Tony Pfaff and a panel from West Point waiting in the wings. And with that, come on out, folks. I'll turn it over to Tony. Oh, hey, and if, by the way, if you have not grabbed the proceedings from the previous years, not last year's, but the previous year's proceedings of the McCain conference, we've got copies out there on the desk. Ed is the editor of this collected volume. A similar work will be created in the future of yesterday's proceedings as well. So make sure you grab one of these on the way out. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, sir. All right. Well, I'll be brief so we can get into it, but I think we have a really interesting panel to start things off today, because a lot of the ideas that we'll discuss, I think, will have tie-ins to the things that we learned yesterday. So we're going to talk about character development and assessment at West Point. For me, this is kind of a treat since I'm an external reviewer for the program. This makes my job easy. I'll just take some notes, write the report while you're talking, and I'll be done. So thanks for that. But we have with us Dr. Yasmine Kalkstein, who is the lead integrator of the U.S. Military Academy's Character Integration Advisory Group. She received her PhD in educational psychology with a focus on learning and cognition from the University of Minnesota. We also have Dr. Peter Meindl, who is an assistant professor and chair for honor and character assessment at the United States Military Academy. His work focuses on moral performance, character formation, and assessment. And then we have Dr. Elise Dykhuis, as an assistant professor of psychology and a data analyst at the U.S. Military Academy. Her research focuses broadly on individual pathways for character development among college students, and her work integrates the concept of character virtues with developmental theory and meta theory. So a nice combination of sort of the philosophical things we talked about and the cognitive and psychological things we talked about yesterday. So over to you.
All right, good morning. I like when people say that back. That's very nice. So character, no surprise, has been a part of West Point since its inception. And our mission really inspires us with the idea that we are to build our graduates into commissioned leaders of character. Now, all facets of West Point help with this mission. So, for example, the academic program may be focused on critical thinking in the classroom. Our physical program in a PE class, boxing, let's say, they might be focused on physical courage. Our military program might be focused on obedience or loyalty, perhaps, in field exercises. Those of us on stage are part of a team that is focused on, wrong way. Hold on, there we go. Is focused on explicit character development and assessment and integration across the academy. So what do we focus on? So first of all, we want to make sure that our cadets understand what they're getting into. This is particularly important in the first 2 years. Our cadets actually are not bound to serve in the Army until affirmation, which is 2 years into the program. So we really want to make sure that we front load this part into our character program to make sure they understand what does it mean to be an officer, what's expected of them. The second piece is honor education. I have heard that there are some West Point grads here. Does anyone remember that honor code? Do not what? Or? Very nice. Okay, excellent. So a big part of our character program is ensuring that we understand the standards of the honor code, that we're inspired to uphold it, with the idea that internalizing this code has an effect on your behavior for life. The third piece is intrapersonal development. So we know, right, that good leaders are those that first and foremost know themselves, right? Self-awareness leads to self-control, making the proper decisions at the right time. So a lot of our character program, as you're gonna see, is gonna focus on aspects of building self-awareness, understanding their strengths, their weaknesses, being able to set goals, for example. And the third piece, this was highlighted yesterday, right? The idea of communication skills. We manifest our character through our interaction with others. The Army is a team of teams. So the interpersonal skills matter a lot to making sure they function well as a team. So what is our approach to character education? Well, first of all, we want to inspire our cadets. And so we focus on motivation. We want them to want to grow their character. We do this in different ways. For example, we provide them with stories of exemplars. We have them consider big picture. What do you want to do with your life, right? So that ideally, as they create their goals and go through experiences, they're aligning it with their purpose. So we want them to want it. Number two, we want them to believe that they can change, right? This is the idea of a growth mindset. So for example, we actually talk about evidence that your brain changes and you can grow. We have them reflect on how their character has changed even before they came to West Point. So you can want something, right, and you can know you can change, but the third piece is really the how, and that's the means. So our character education program is also focused on providing tools, knowledge, skills, everything from when you hit a failure, what is the best way to be able to reframe that failure as an opportunity to growth, skills such as giving and receiving feedback, how to set a goal properly and how to ideally adhere to these goals. That's all part of means. And you're gonna see that come back again when we talk about assessment because we assess along those dimensions as well. So, program highlights. I wanna be brief with this because I want you to have a chance to ask questions about what you'd like me to dig deeper into. So I'm just gonna highlight a few of the programs that we have going on. So I'm actually going to start at the very end of the curriculum, right before they graduate. Oh, sorry, these all came up at the same time. Here we go. So right before they graduate, they take a course called MX400, which is our course is known as officership. This is run by the Simon Center for Professional Military Ethic. In this course, they're really focused on moral leadership, understanding the Army profession, understanding some of the current challenges in the Army profession, being able to reflect on their own character development journey. And I think one of the most important parts of the courses is being presented with complex military problems and having to create solutions to these problems along tactical, strategic, but also ethical points of view. This is a very popular course at the Academy. It's been received well, and it seems to do a really great job preparing cadets for the type of challenges they're going to handle as officers. So now I'm gonna go all the way to the very beginning. So West Point cadets, when they first come in the summer, like soldiers, they go through basic training. And what we've done is we have aligned a character program alongside cadet basic training. And this is our third year doing this. It's squad level conversations. So these are character conversations occurring daily alongside basic training. So last year, for example, it was 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. every night. They went into their squad. And what did they do? The idea was to build virtue literacy, so to help them build the language that we're going to use and what's important at West Point, to be able to share stories that would hopefully inspire them, and also to give them a chance to reflect on a team. What was challenging today? How did we do, and how do we want to do better tomorrow? Now, what was interesting about this is we were really focused on making a difference for these new cadets. But I would say one of the most powerful parts of the program was that we were actually giving squad leaders the chance to lead. Now, who are the squad leaders? They've been at West Point for 2 years, so they are still students at West Point, and they are actually leading these conversations. And I think that was one of the places that we had the biggest impact, because they were getting daily reps on talking about character and leading others, helping their team reflect. Was it perfect? No, right? The first time I taught, it was probably a mess too, right? But the idea is that we were helping to support that. This year, there's a few revisions that we're making on the 3rd iteration. One is continuing to work on the leader development part. How can we develop them and arm them with the skills to do this best? And the second thing is we're looking at aligning it alongside aligning better with the military field exercises they're doing. So for example, let's say you're gonna do rifle marksmanship today, right? You have to shoot a gun and hit a target. That's how I understand it, at least. You can tell I was in the Army for many years. So what we're doing now is the squad leader, before they go into it, they're gonna talk about what temptations do we have? What kind of character challenges might there be? Well, maybe you're gonna be impatient because you've been hunting your whole life. Or maybe you're gonna be tempted to cheat because no one can really tell what the bullet hit, right? And so we talk about the temptations, right? Then after they go through the exercise, they have a reflection period. Hey, how did we do as a team? What stood out? What virtues did we exhibit? Maybe where can we do better tomorrow? So, sorry, I'm forgetting to go here. So, like I said, our squad leaders are getting a lot of training as well. Now, after their first year, they have something called cadet field training. So they go back out into the field. And so with cadet field training, we're also having these squad level conversations, also taught by the rising, what we call cows, right? Those that are 2 years in. And with cadet field training this year, we're especially focusing on the relationship between character and trust in a team, in particular interpersonal skills, as well as learning to give feedback to each other. So every day they're gonna practice one-on-one giving feedback to each other around character, right? Which can be challenging, as you can imagine, but is an important skill for future officers to be able to talk about this and counsel their subordinates and each other. Okay, so let's talk about co-curricular character development. So for many years now, we've had something called the Cadet Character Education Program. Of course, we abbreviate it, CCEP, because it's the Army. And this occurs during commandant's hours. It occurs immediately after lunch. Anyone who's been a professor can imagine that is a fantastic time to teach, right? Okay, a bit of a problem there. It's an interesting program that we've played a lot with, perhaps because it's after lunch, perhaps because there's a tendency to sometimes just brief. Cadets don't always love CCEP the way they should. I see West Point cadets smiling there. I don't expect, you guys have to hold a straight face here. So anyway, sometimes these are done by faculty, led by faculty. Sometimes they're led by cadets. Sometimes they're standardized, sometimes they aren't. We're still trying to figure out the best ways to make this work. Some things I think we're doing very well. So one of the most popular aspects of the program is something called Leader Challenge. So Leader Challenge occurs in the final 2 years at West Point as part of CCEP. Essentially, they're presented, it's problem-based learning. They're presented, I'm hitting the wrong thing. They're presented with a video that an officer records about a challenge or dilemma, something that they experienced, and they tell the story. And as the story unravels, cadets listen, and then they pause. And now cadets have to talk about what they're understanding, but moreover, what would you do if you're in the situation that this officer is in? And so they discuss what would we do, they share out, and then they actually play the rest of the video. What did the officer do in this situation? And then there's some reflection. There's often no right or wrong. These are challenging ethical dilemmas sometimes that officers find themselves in, but it's a chance for cadets to get some sense of what kind of challenges might you be experiencing when you're an officer and practice the ethical critical thinking. So we recognize, though, that with CCEP, in that first year when they first get to West Point, we needed something that was more deliberate, sequential, evidence-based, a little bit stronger to really help acculturate them into the Army profession. So we are now in a second-year pilot of what you can think of as a first-year experience. It's a first-year seminar. The first year is called plebe, or they're called plebes at West Point. So it's a plebe character seminar. It meets once a week with a faculty member. They do this in their company. A company is typically split into 2 sections. So you have a section of 18 students that you carry through this curriculum for an entire year. Currently, we have 8 companies going through this pilot, and we're actually preparing for a scale up. If we are able to scale it up, it's probably going to be junior officers teaching it, and they come from all departments, right? They're gonna come from math, engineering, history. So one of the things that we're really thinking about right now is how do we develop faculty to do this well? If I were to summarize like the teaching philosophy of this in 3 words, it would be not a brief. That's gonna be the goal, right, of how we're gonna teach this. We're not gonna teach it as a brief. So what are we gonna do? So one of the things we try to do is really allow cadets to discuss, to wrestle with ideas in the class, with the idea that when you have a chance to wrestle with something, you're more likely to internalize it. So we may ask them questions like, how do you balance humility and confidence? Inspire, we're gonna share, or we currently share stories, right, of moral exemplars, for example. Reflect, we give cadets a chance to think of their own strengths and weaknesses, develop a goal, that something about their character that they want to improve, and we actually have them meet with someone, a friend of mutual accountability, right, over a course of 6 lessons or so to share out how they're doing on their goal. And then practice is a big piece of the course. We have them practice skills, practice giving each other feedback, practice active listening, practice intervening, role-playing like a bystander situation where they have to intervene. I'm not gonna go into all of this just because of time, but this is what the curriculum looks like for next year, and I'm happy to take questions around it. You can tell that it's a balance of both orientation into the Army profession and West Point, sort of a journey of the self where you focus on what you need to improve about yourself, as well as emotional regulation strategies. We even do mindfulness meditation. We teach them that skill and bring that through a 7-lesson sequence of that. And then we move into interpersonal skills, the skills that you need to lead and work with a team. The last piece I want to highlight is faculty development. So as Navy calls it, developing the developers, right? At West Point, one of our lines of effort is developing a culture of character growth. And so we believe that includes the faculty. So I'll start by saying, how is that happening? One of the ways is we're actually working with current core courses that already exist and looking at how we can align the language, where are opportunities to bring in character. Obviously, we do direct education, so faculty workshops, even consultation with coaches who have a real impact at West Point on our cadets. And then the third piece that we noticed was that there was a gap for civilians who haven't been in the Army didn't always understand, like, what does it mean to be a leader of character? What is it that officers, what kind of character traits do officers really need to have? And so we created this program. I know it's probably gonna fool you, but these are not Army officers. In the middle, there's me. These are actually civilians, and we took them out to Camp Buckner to field training. We slept in bays. We did 3 days, 2 nights, took them through obstacles, took them through different challenges. At the same time, we had courses on the Army profession. What kind of character does the modern officer need today in the Army? It was a very impactful, experiential experiential experience. That doesn't sound right, but you know what I'm saying. A lot of experience. And in the end, it helped our faculty better understand the cadet experience, but really help them understand that they too, even though they don't have necessarily an Army background, have a role in supporting this mission of developing leaders of character. So I had the easy part, which was talking about what we do. The harder part now is talking about how to assess it. So I'm going to turn over to Elise.
Great. So hopefully, thank you so much, Yasmine. Hopefully after that, you're feeling like this is amazing. They're doing so much. The West Point and the Army are using evidence-based strategies from pedagogical and psychological sciences to build out a holistic curriculum. We can all go home and expect that we're going to have the impact that we want to have. And if that were the case, then I would not have a job. So the fun part that I get to do is talk about assessment. But not only assessment, but kind of where assessment, particularly with character research and evaluation, actually seems to be languishing a little bit. So there was a recent paper published on shame in character education. So I'm hoping that as a person part of this process, I can kind of shame myself into doing better with character assessment. So I will start with talking about how exactly do we go about doing character assessment at West Point by using everything that we think is kind of wrong with character assessment up until this point. Character evaluation and assessment is still very much in its infancy. There's a lot of work that has been emerging in the last couple decades in order to inform how we understand if programs are indeed working. But there's still a long way to go. So I'm really grateful to Dan and Rich for their talks yesterday because it really tees us up for a couple more things I could complain about when it comes to character assessment. So to start, we need to understand why are we doing character assessment at all, particularly at West Point. When we talk about evaluation, we want to know what's the purpose, what's the end game, what's the outcome that we're interested in. And as Yasmine mentioned, part of that is understanding whether mindset, motivation, and the means are indeed being developed in our cadets. But in addition, we have broader assessment outcomes that we track in order to understand whether or not those outcomes are being impacted, as well as whether or not specific programs are working. So again, how is the core developing? On the aggregate, using means, I know, Dan and Rich, using means sometimes can be a useful way of understanding programming as long as the aggregate level conception is something that is important to the goals that you have. We want to know, on the whole, is the core developing character? So we use broad means over time, longitudinal, within person, as well as between person data to understand, are we developing character? In addition, we want to know who are the outliers. We want to be able to identify which cadets are really excelling at being exemplars of character, as well as those that might need a little bit of support and help. So how do we intervene with the cadets that might need support when it comes to their character formation? Again, we're charged with commissioning leaders of character, but also how do we then highlight the exemplars that might actually help in that process? So keeping track of both individuals over time as well as these broad means over time. And then, as I mentioned before, what's the impact of specific programming? Again, as Yasmine mentioned, we have some historical programs that have continued to be iterated on, but we also are starting new initiatives. And we want to know, is that benefit additive? Is it multiplicative? Is it detracting or subtracting from our cadets' development? Again, our greatest asset and resource is time. So are we making use of the cadets' time and the faculty's time in a way that is benefiting their character formation over and above what we've already been doing? So these are the big questions that we try to ask ourselves, in addition to tracking, again, the mindset, the motivation, and the means by which cadets can form themselves. So as I mentioned, I haven't gotten to it yet, but there's a couple things that character assessment doesn't allow us to do in order to assess a lot of this well. So what are those problems? Again, Dan and Rich mentioned some of these things in their talk yesterday, but this is really with a lens towards people who are in context, applying some of these things in environments where you might not have necessarily the luxury of doing a big research project as your primary goal. So what we try to do is research, but also assessment. And so trying to figure out what's the balance between using evidence-based strategies to do that evaluation and balancing that with the fact that sometimes we have time constraints and resource constraints in order to do something that might be more intensive in order to evaluate those outcomes I just had on the last slide. So the three big things are that character assessment is ineffective, it's inefficient, and it's tedious. So again, if I were to throw this up when somebody was trying to put out a call for someone to do character assessment at West Point, I don't think that any administrators would be like super gung-ho about hiring a person whose expertise is in this. But I think that what we're going to present on is how can we get through some of these various problems by using other evidence-based strategies that already exist in the psychological literature. So the first is broad character assessment. So speaking of the VIA, which was brought up yesterday, or these holistic measures trying to get at multiple dimensions of character at once. They're ineffective. And what I mean by that, oh, I pressed the up button. So what I mean by that is it has questionable validity. So we talked about yesterday in the two talks that validity is super important because it tells us whether or not this thing is measuring what we think it's measuring. So I can call a measure empathy, but I could ask you any set of questions, and if those questions don't actually map onto the construct of empathy, then I could call it empathy, but it's indeed not empathy. So these measures have questionable validity because of the processes that we use statistically to determine validity don't actually always get at that construct internalization. So we have an issue with whether or not it's actually a valid measure of the thing that we said that it measures. Remember, there were some sample items put up on I am a humble person. I don't think I'm a very good judge of my own humility, quite frankly. So we have that as one problem, but also predictive validity. A lot of these measures don't actually predict outcomes that we expect would be impacted by embodying those characteristics. So a measure of empathy might not actually very well predict if I'm going to have a trustworthy officer out in the real army. So what's the use in that if I don't have any opportunity to predict any behavior or any attitudes or cognition in the future that would help me to know that this is a good thing to develop in the first place? They might embody empathy, but if it doesn't predict anything that I think is useful in embodying empathy, other than embodying it in and of itself, then why would I use that measure in order to predict those things? In addition, sometimes there are measures of aspects of empathy or compassion, but it's comprised of so many dimensions. So again, there are affective, behavioral, and cognitive dimensions of every type of character attribute. But we can't get that with one quantitative self-report measure necessarily. So we have limited scope, both by rater, right? I'm a limited actor in my life. There are other people who witness my character that I am not good at evaluating. And there's also multiple different types of contexts, as we discussed yesterday, where people enact certain levels of character based on what's appropriate, but also how practiced I am in those environments. So we're limited in the scope of what those measures actually tell us. If I'm just administering, again, a measure on empathy, but I'm not looking at, okay, how am I empathic with my little sister, as opposed to maybe with a colleague, right? That's not a very holistic view of my true level of empathy. And in addition, they're not designed to measure change. This is a huge issue in doing developmental intervention work. If the measures are not developed to actually effectively allow me to look at a mean and how it changed and say that change in that mean is meaningful, then how am I supposed to say that some sort of character intervention was impactful in changing something in someone? So these are not designed to measure anything other than broad means at one point in time. They are not change sensitive. So that's the first problem I have with this. The second is that it's inefficient. Again, these broad character measures, again, I'll bring up the VIA, the Values and Action Survey that was brought up yesterday, they're long. And if you've ever taken a long survey, I bet you don't even want to take the airport survey that's 1 minute after you connect to the internet. But imagine being told when you sit down in class, hey, we're going to take this 200 plus item survey that you're not going to get any feedback on, and thank you so much for your time. Right? That's not very encouraging both to the instructor, but also to the student. How is that helpful for their formation? That time invested, especially at the service academies, is such a crucial resource. So the more you eat into that, and the less that the student gets back from that, and the less that the faculty member gets back from that, to say, okay, here's how I can impact your formation, it's a lose-lose situation. If no one wants to engage with it, it's going to lead then to the tedium of these evaluations, which is a lack of participant motivation. Again, if you know that this is going to take you 10, 15 minutes, that's 10, 15 minutes where I'm just checking the box. I'm just trying to get through that survey, all 5s, right? You've done that before. We've all done it because our time is precious. But also, we don't normally get to see what's on the other end that I actually gain something from. And as I mentioned, there's a lack of stakeholder desire then to administer those tools. Because sometimes individuals just don't know how to use them. I think that's why there's a lot of reliance on personality measures, because it's very easy for us to self-interpret a personality test, whereas in this case, it's not always easy for stakeholders to want to administer because they just don't understand how to then impart that information back. But also because, again, it takes up time. It's something that it's very hard to see the reward on the other end other than, okay, I've got 15 minutes out of my class or out of my day where I now have to take this survey. And as a result, as I mentioned, right, there's the person that's always going to check 5s. You reduce the external validity of the character assessments. So you're not actually you're reducing the effectiveness and the data quality because you're giving them something that they actually don't want to engage with, and that as they keep going through, there is an exhaustion that happens as a result. The final thing is, and I think a lot of us have had this experience, when you send out a survey and there's no incentive by any stretch, right? There's only detracting from time or resources, then you don't get a representative sample. So the example I use in my stats class is if we send out a survey and 4% of the core responds, those people are probably weird. Right? So I want every cadet and every midshipman in this room to know, like, please respond to the surveys. But you know that they're not representative of the normal student. You're not going to get that distribution of the true representative sample of your student body or of your faculty, right? The faculty who respond to those surveys are really weird. Like, who's got time for that? So I bring that up because if we're making policy and institutional decisions based on assessments that are like this for things that are core to the mission of our institutions, we are probably not making the right policy decisions based on that information. And so as a result, what we have tried to do as part of our character education program is come together between our 2 major organizations that do this work and figure out how do we improve within the context of doing applied character work in a college setting. So I'll pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Meindl.
All right, so I have to start off by lowering expectations maybe. So what I'm talking about here is I'm going to talk about 5 different ways that we're approaching character education, character assessment, in order to improve character assessment. But I need to keep expectations low because at best, this is never going to be perfect. At best, we will never be able to perfectly know where the character of the core is. At best, I can assume that I know that my coworkers are wonderful people, but they might be monsters. I don't know for sure. I will never know for sure what's going on inside their heads. I will never know for sure how they act when I'm not around. So what we're going to be talking about today First of all, our first approach, and maybe our biggest shift in how we're assessing character, is to almost, or in large part, not assess character itself, but instead assess the factors that we assume or suspect based on psychological literature contribute to development of character, so that if we can assess these things, and if we do find that cadets are increasing and improving on these factors, we can be fairly confident that downstream we would see improvement in character or virtues if we were able to capture that with high degrees of fidelity. But I'll say more about that and why we're doing that in a little bit. We do assess some traits, we do assess some virtues, but not a lot. Instead, we're focusing on those few virtues that seem to be especially important for a couple different reasons. I'll talk about that in a second. We're increasingly comparing the data from our cadets to data from external sources. Service Academy cadets and midshipmen, that's what we're aiming for in large part, but also just the world at large. And ideally nationally representative samples of college students. And we have some data on that I'll talk about in a bit. But that part is kind of in its infancy. We're attempting to go beyond status quo self-assessment or self-report. Not that there's anything wrong with self-report, actually. Self-report is really useful. But in itself, it's hugely flawed. But in itself, any assessment of character is hugely flawed. It's really only when you're combining many different approaches to character assessment that you're going to be getting something that you would find useful. And then lastly, we're attempting to make it more engaging for our cadets. If we were to ask those cadets over there how engaging character assessment is at West Point, I don't think we'd like the answer. But our hope is that their answer would be different than it was 3 years ago. And maybe in 3 years it'll be even more different. We're attempting to address this in a few different ways I'll talk about in a second. First, though, the key developmental factors. Again, as Dr. Kalkstein mentioned, we call these the 3 M's. And so based on our understanding of psychological literature, on development, behavior change, but also character development, we think that there are 3 developmental factors that seem especially important. And if these things are developing our cadets, then we, again, can be fairly confident that downstream we would see improvement in virtues if we were able to capture virtuousness with high degrees of fidelity. We're assessing these instead of placing all of our emphasis on virtues for a couple different reasons. One, we think that it's relatively quick to assess these. So these factors being mindset, motivation, and means. It's fairly easy, and it doesn't take up that much space on a survey to assess something like a growth mindset. In fact, the primary means of assessing growth mindset, it's 3 items. Compare that to, let's say, a humility assessment, or the VIA, which is, as Dr. Dykhuis mentioned, up to 200 items. So one, it's quick. We can quickly assess these different factors. 2, though, we think that we can assess these factors with a higher degree of fidelity than something like humility. Humility might be the most difficult virtue that I can think of to assess, but even relatively easy virtues to assess, like self-control. You're never going to know exactly where a person's self-control is, especially through self-report or even peer report. But we can assess these and have a decent sense of where people are at when it comes to these developmental factors, again, fairly quickly. Because Dr. Kalkstein talked about these to some length, I'm going to skip most of this, but the bottom line is, again, we're choosing to assess primarily these developmental factors because we think that it just makes assessment more effective and efficient. So speaking of efficiency, like I said, we're not primarily assessing virtues themselves, but we are assessing some small pool of what we call seed traits. So seed traits, the way we're thinking of them, there's 2 different types of categories of seed traits. One is predictive traits, and the other is foundational traits. So when we talk about predictive traits, we're talking about certain traits that do a better job of predicting virtuousness or character as a whole than other traits. So for instance, one study showed that gratitude, fairness, and curiosity might be especially predictive of the whole constellation of character. So if you want to assess or if you want to know where a group of people's character is as a whole, but you don't have the time to do that, it makes sense to look at those few traits and assume that if their traits or their trait levels on those traits are high, then their trait levels on other traits, other virtues would be high as well. At West Point, we don't have data that speaks to this yet, but we do have external data that suggests that generally compassion and honesty might be predictive traits. Foundational traits are a little bit different. Foundational traits seem to serve as the foundation for virtuousness as a whole. So it's not just that they predict other virtues, but they might help develop other virtues. So humility, self-control, and selflessness seem to be potential, at least candidate foundational virtues. Humility, for instance, seems to serve as a foundation for gratitude, which in itself seems to serve as a foundation for many, many other virtues. And so our approach is look at the foundational traits, because again, if foundational traits are there, then we can assume that the other character traits will be there, or maybe they already are. Importantly, though, this list of foundational traits and what we're thinking about in terms of what might be seed traits, what we're thinking about is what might work at West Point. A lot of this is going to be context specific, so your different environment might produce or require you to assess different virtues that might serve as foundational and predictive traits. Next, importantly, we have to compare our data to something. Otherwise, we would have a whole bunch of means that tell us, for instance, that cadets they score a 5 out of 7 on some sort of scale. And on its own, that doesn't tell us much of anything. So instead, we have to compare that to something. So for instance, let me go back here. For instance, we're trying to compare where our cadets are at to service academy cadets and midshipmen. But also, as I mentioned earlier, we're also trying to compare our cadets to nationally representative samples of college students. And fortunately, what we have so far suggests that our cadets are doing quite well compared to national average for college students. But without that information, again, we wouldn't know what a 5 out of 7 means. Is that good? Is that awful? Really, we wouldn't be able to say. Similarly, we need comparative information to figure out what trends in the core mean. So for instance, this is completely hypothetical, but imagine that we had some overall character score, and it showed that from 4th class to 1st class, we didn't see much growth in our cadets. That could be a horrible thing because we want them to grow, but it could be a wonderful thing because maybe at a typical civilian institution, this is what the trajectory of character growth or development looks like. Again, it could be horrible though, because maybe this is what it actually looks like, or maybe it's exactly the same as our trend. Without being able to compare this to something else, we just don't know what this means. Next, we're attempting to go beyond status quo self-report. So this means a couple different things. One, we're attempting to use different forms of self-reports. So for instance, experience sampling. Experience sampling means that you're asking people about their behavior or their thoughts or their emotions, not just once and asking them, what type of person are you? But you're asking in this moment or in the past couple hours, what have you thought? What have you done? And then you can aggregate that to get an average sense of where they're at, but you can also look at those individual data points. And then we're also placing heavy emphasis on peer and informant reports. We don't know how cadets act when we're not around, so we need to know what the other cadets know. And at least they feel like they have a pretty good understanding of what their fellow cadets' character is like when we're not around. And at the very least, that's valuable information. It's probably flawed in its own right, just like self-report is, just like our assessments of the character are, but combined, we're reducing that error. And so one way we're doing this is through a peer evaluation where we just ask our cadets, for instance, one question like, who do you trust? And in summer training, we compare two different people in their squad. And for each person in the squad, they're asked to compare that person to another person in the squad, and they compare that person to everybody in their squad. And then we create ELO ratings, just like you might see ELO ratings for the NFL or the NBA. So you can compare teams that haven't even played against each other. And so in doing this, we can get a sense of, we can actually get a rank of where cadets are at in terms of their trustworthiness or perceived trust or whatever it is we're assessing. And cadets don't have to actually rank their squad members. They can do this instead because they really don't like ranking each other. But this is doing that work without requiring them to rank each other. We're going to skip this for the sake of time. One thing I will mention, though, is that, again, peer report is flawed just like self-report is flawed. It's combining these different forms of assessment that's going to make this stuff work well. So for instance, this isn't real data exactly, but it's similar. What we found at the end of COVID was that compared to national average when it comes to life satisfaction, cadet peers felt like cadets were not doing well, but self-report, they're doing fine. So in this case, the problem is in peer report rather than self-report. So it's all a little bit messed up, but combined, it's less messed up. The last thing I'll say related to this is we aren't relying terribly heavily on existing measures. Certainly if there's an existing measure that fits our purpose, that's great. But we're not going to squeeze our purpose into an existing measure. Instead, we're going to take an existing measure that's useful to our purpose, if that exists, and if it doesn't, we're going to create our own. I'm actually going to skip this also for the sake of time, and just say the last thing we're working on is making things more engaging in a few different ways. One, as somebody mentioned yesterday, offering feedback can be useful to increase engagement in these sorts of things, and we're doing that. Two, we're attempting to tie the assessment actually to character formation. One way of doing this is just telling them how we might use this data to improve their character education experience. But another is telling them, for instance, you scored low on humility. And we haven't done this yet, but what you can do is then offer them to participate in a humility intervention fairly easily by, say, giving them a link to a humility intervention. There's lots of evidence-based interventions for many different types of character traits online that you can just link to. Another is just making this assessment piece part of a larger character initiative. So for instance, you could have them assess their own character, give them feedback, and then use that feedback to set goals for themselves going forward in terms of the character, and we've done that. And I think it increases engagement because this is just not just an assessment and then it's done. It's leading to something else. And obviously you want to make, at the very least, you want to make the purpose of your assessment clear. Because if it's just a black box and it's not clear that this is actually going to benefit anything, then why would anybody be motivated to participate in this other than somebody told them to? And the last thing I'll say about this is we think that peer assessment also might enhance engagement because I think people just, as humans, like to judge other people. So in a way, it feels nice. But B, I think on a more positive note, I think our cadets really do want to help form their fellow cadets. And so if they see this peer assessment as a way to do that, then that'll enhance motivation. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
All All right, Ed, I think you said we could go a full hour, so we still have about a little less than 15 minutes for questions. So your questions. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Austin, class 24. So this is for the entire panel, but when you're looking at the career ratings, how do you
So one big concern is that there might be certain types of bias that influence these types of assessments. I don't have a great answer to how we address that. One thing I will say is we do see some small degree of evidence of bias, but this is cold comfort, but it's bias all around. We see a homophily effect in responses to peer assessments, meaning that so each group demographically rates themselves a little bit higher. But fortunately, I mean, one is fortunately we haven't seen it everywhere you might expect. We don't see gender differences, for instance. And two, the differences are very, very small. One possibility going forward that we could, one way to address this is to just note that in the past we have seen these differences, and there's some evidence that that addresses it. Sometimes that actually flips it, but most of the time it seems that that's going to address the problem. And again, all I'll say is that fortunately these differences haven't been big, or the evidence of bias has been very small. And again, we haven't seen it everywhere, and everywhere we might expect. Anything to add?
Yes, sir.
Could you clarify what you mean by bridging the gap there? Sorry.
So, from the first presentation, which is really good, all were great, you're molding these young men and women to be men and women of character, which is going to be based on a foundation. But you have people coming in, they're not from World War II era, they're not from the Vietnam era, it's a different world from when I went to school, and they have different worldviews.
Right.
They're not going to agree on things, basically no matter what you do.
Right, so I can start and then I'll turn over to you. I think this is the larger problem, right, of in general, the Army, that really any military organization faces, right? We have to bring together diverse groups to work together to adopt a common ethos, right, in order to win. So I think that we first of all understand that, but I think what we're doing even in the physical realm, right, could kind of be used as sort of a parallel to what we're doing in the character realm, right? Everybody has to meet certain standards. So I think it really starts with communicating what's important in the Army. That's what we really tried to do in the CBT experience. So we start with virtue literacy, what matters in the Army values, right? Why is this important? And we give them a chance to discuss and talk about it, not just brief at them. But ultimately, a decision has to be made, right? And I'll turn it over to my colleagues to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is, and might address your question, we attempt to just, especially early on, have them think about their bigger purpose, and particularly some sort of self-transcendent purpose, which sounds kind of new agey maybe, but what we really mean is they've got to have, or hopefully they have, or at least we can help them develop some sort of sense of a higher purpose, something that is outside of themselves. And that seems like something that can very well serve as a foundation for all that follows. Especially, so one other thing we do after we have them think, hopefully deeply, about what their self-transcendent purpose is how character formation, and particularly the type of character formation they're going to be taking part in at West Point, relates to that higher purpose. So how is it that developing humility is actually going to help you get to where you want to go and contribute to the world in the way you want to? And of course, how is just generally being a good cadet and being a good officer going to contribute to that effort? And I think this is related to another talk yesterday. One reason we do this is because we hope and expect that this self-transcendent purpose is something that's going to be with them not just during their time at West Point, but it's going to be in every context that follows their time at West Point. So virtue is very context specific, it seems. We hit on that yesterday too. But purpose seems to be less context specific. So that does seem to be the foundation that could pull everything together.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one example I thought of. When I was teaching character growth seminar last fall, my cadets struggled with patriotism and whether that was a necessity to being an officer. And I let them debate it, and we discussed it, and ultimately we brought together a panel of officers. And so we created a separate class specifically for this, and we had them discuss their viewpoints. And it was interesting, because I think that, to your point, this may not have been something that a generation maybe 40 years ago is struggling with as much as this generation. But I think we have to note it, we have to address it, we have to figure out how do we set expectations, but also give the space to sort of discuss and wrestle a little bit.
And I'll just add one very quick thing. So I think the context specificity of this conversation is really important. Bridging divides across higher education is something that is very salient, regardless if you're in a service academy. But I think that we have a really strong opportunity to use the fact that cadets and midshipmen are choosing to come to a service academy with a common goal, and using that as the springboard, as my colleagues mentioned, to talk about self-transcendent purpose, bringing in previous generations of officers and soldiers to talk about why they came, and finding those commonalities that allow you to feel connected to, as we say, the long gray line. But that exists in these institutions that have these greater values that are superimposed on the big I institution. This happens at religious schools, but also at service academies. So we have an opportunity to leverage that, to use some of these evidence-based strategies from psychology, from pedagogy, from philosophy, et cetera, in order to promote these lifelong efforts to develop purpose, which will transcend them being in the Army, being in the Navy. And I think that's an opportunity that we have that other institutions don't get in thinking about how do we bridge those divides, how do we find those base commonalities that all of the students have endorsed by coming to that institution.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand the question. So you're saying that the fourth class system, namely probably being yelled at more and that kind of structure that's imposed on plebes, how does that mesh with what we're trying to do? Okay, so first of all, the challenge of beast is not going away. I remember a year ago I sat down with a squad as they were having one of their character conversations. And turned out they had just gotten smoked by their squad leader, right? So they had just, I don't know, had to do wall sits or push-ups, or I'm not sure what exactly they did wrong. But he was then able to pivot and say, okay, let's talk about character. And that's what a leader needs to be able to do, right? Is hold standards, be tough when you need to be tough, but also understand that you're in a developmental and an educational role. So it's a high expectation on our squad leaders to both be, the disciplinarian, but also be the educator. But that's what we're training them for. So none of the toughness is going away. We're just ensuring that they have the space to reflect and process so that they're growing as they're going through it. Does that get at your question?
It does.
Okay.
And I know as an old rep, we hear over the years that hazing has been outlawed probably 20 times, since I've been. So let's do data collection here. The cadets in the big shit. Any of you guys ever been hazed? Raise your hand.
It's a trap. It's a trap.
But I will say being exposed to stress, as you mentioned, maybe the most valuable thing that we learned is that
Yeah.
you can really be in at boxing, to know that you can be under physical stress, but don't freak out. Think.
Right. I'll tell you, I went through the first R-Day rehearsal when they had changed from shark attack to first 100 yards. I got yelled at plenty, and it was very scary. But then there was a moment when they said, okay, listen, I'm going to help you get there, right? And so it was really kind of combining the two models. It's challenging for sure, but I think it has a greater benefit to our cadets in terms of character development.
So is this a quick follow-up on your part? Because I've got someone over there who has a question. Is this just a quick follow-up that's relevant to this conversation?
Oh, I just have my own question.
Okay, so you'll be next. We'll get one over there.
Well, I have a question on your
So that's a great question, and something that is definitely, I think, hopefully on the horizon. One of the huge benefits of working in the military is there's mounds of data that are just institutionally collected, but unfortunately we don't always have access to it in the ways that we would hope, and we're working on building those relationships so that we can have a look at the practical outcomes that might be affected by the programming that we're doing. It's also the case that one thing we didn't mention is that sometimes there's delayed effects, right? So we might be doing programming. I know for all of us that have gone through the higher education experience, we didn't see the impact, just like David Brooks brought up yesterday, of our experiences until much later maybe in life. Whatever our hated book became our most favorite book, or realizing something was formative after the fact. So we're realizing that even if we don't see those effects immediately, we would hope that they would pervade the service once our cadets are out being officers in the Army. I will say that, again, there are some metrics that we have internally that are measured at the institutional level that we're hoping we can connect to this data. We are looking into officer evaluation reports and seeing how that connects to various character attributes. But at this point, we're not there yet, but the hope is that, again, we're able to predict and see what those downstream effects are of the work that we're doing at the Academy.
You.
So my question is also on peer assessment. My name is Jeff Baumgartner, used to 24. And in my experience, oftentimes peer assessment surveys, they've often been viewed as popularity contests. And then there's always people that left at the bottom that they're ranked low, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're black people characters. So I was just wondering how do you plan on counteracting this?
So I'll say this, and I'm imagining all of you have taken this peer evaluation at some point then. Okay, so the way that we at least train the peer evaluation is in part to help mitigate that. So we talk about how with this homophily effect, not just looking like someone else, but also being friends with someone, right, doesn't necessarily always equate to actual trust. So trying to make sure that we're thinking through those things when we're rating, our peers on how much we trust them. So trying to mitigate it up front, but also realizing that when we train the individuals that use the peer evaluation for counseling, so it's usually tactical officers that are out in the field, we ensure that they know that just because you're at the bottom of a ranking, again, it's embedded within squads, that you could be in super awesome squad. Someone's always gonna be at the bottom. You could also be in super terrible squad and someone's always gonna be at the top. So it's contextualized by other information, and I think that's another big part of what we're trying to do with the assessment is not just using the peers, but also using every facet of self-evaluation, observation reports from, other officers that are out in the field to contextualize the fact that there is going to be someone in the middle, at the bottom, at the top, and that is highly contingent on what is that squad doing and what's the combination of people that are in that squad.
I want to say one more thing about that. So one possibility is what you're describing is, at least in part, what psychologists refer to as a halo effect, which is if somebody is high on one attribute, they're perceived to be high on another attribute. And so two things that are relevant related to that. One, there are ways to deal with that. So for instance, you can ask people not just how much character this person have, but why do you say that? What gives you the impression that this person deserves to be ranked this way or whatever? But the other thing I'll say is, for better or for worse, the halo effect exists in part because it's reality. So people who are rated as likable, they might actually also have high character and go down the line, actually. Positive attributes are actually correlated with each other because people with positive attributes have other positive attributes. So to some extent, we actually wouldn't want to get rid of even the popularity contest portion, because people might be popular, especially at a place like West Point, in part because they have high character. But certainly we want to tease that out, and there are some ways that we can tease that out.
Okay, got time for one more question. You can probably tell I've been trying to alternate between young people and old people, so we'll give this question to General Miller. You figure out which category you fit in, and this will be the last one.
One thing I'll say, just because they're busy people, sometimes nuance isn't appreciated. Means are important for policy briefs, I'll say. They're important for other reasons, and I've had conversations with the folks from yesterday's talk about when means are important and when they're not. One time they are very important is when you're actually conveying information to people. And so the bottom line is you just have to make it simple or simplify without losing important nuance. But our experience, at least, is that they're very open to what we have to present to them. But I will say one thing related to what I mentioned at the beginning, like don't get your hopes up too high, is what I think I've experienced, not just at West Point, but elsewhere. When you're not familiar with character assessment, you might have the expectation that there's going to be this one-to-one correspondence between what the data says and where a person's character actually is, and that is just never going to happen. That's a pipe dream, as far as I can tell. And so I think that sometimes people have that expectation, and we have to disabuse them of that expectation, because instead what we're trying to do is just make this stuff better than it was yesterday instead of make it perfect.
All right, well, let's give the panel a big hand for sparking this really great discussion, and I think now we're on break.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Tony. And Yasmine, Peter, and Elise, that's a great start to our comparative character program inquiry today. And let's take a 20-minute break. Great. Awesome. I love texting. You don't have to get nervous.